Hello again, and welcome to In Conversation. My name is Paul Wells. I'm senior writer at Maclean's magazine, and uh, as always, we like to thank our sponsors at the Canadian Bankers Association for bringing these conversations to you every 2 weeks now. Used to be monthly, then it was weekly. Now it's every 2 weeks. Our next session in a couple of weeks will be dealing with the U.S. election, which will then be looming even more ominously than it's looming now. We're lining up a really good panel of American political analysts. But for now, we have a Canadian political analyst and investigative journalist and author and friend and colleague, Justin Ling, who is the author of Missing from the Village, which has an ungodly long subtitle, which I'll read for you now. The story of serial killer Bruce McArthur, the search for justice, and the system that failed Toronto's queer community. Justin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to have you on for a few reasons. First of all, this was a major story that lasted really close to a decade, from the commission of the murders through the initial failed investigations to finally the capture and trial of Bruce McArthur. Also because you're one of my favorite reporters. You're industrious, and because this is your first book, and so I wanted to walk through the process of deciding to write a book, the journalistic choice of a book as an outlet for your work, but first of all, let's start with the story itself, which is complex, has many aspects. What's your main message, I guess, as you said about writing this book?
I think the one thing I focused on a lot was time, right? I think a lot of people engage with this story like they would with a lot of tragic news. And, when this story was in the headlines, Toronto and the country was just facing horrible story after horrible story. People might not even remember, that a lot of these were simultaneous, but just in the middle of the Bruce McArthur investigation was the Toronto van attack, which claimed the lives of many in the north end of Toronto. And, so I think a lot of people, understandably, engaged with the story, kind of followed it, but may not have had a grasp on just sort of how enormous and kind of long-ranging it was. The first man to go missing in this case was in 2010. Police originally set up an investigation in 2013 and closed it. I began working on the story in 2015. It wasn't until 2017 that police reopened the investigation after another pair of disappearances. When finally they made an arrest in 2018, they realized that it wasn't 2 or 5 victims, it was 8. So it was this sort of sprawling, horrifying investigation that for many, like you said, was decades-long experience. There were people who had to organize to try to help find their friend when he first went missing, who had to kind of relive that when the investigation was reopened, who had to kind of relive it year after year, only to have to face one of the most horrifying and extensive investigations in Canadian history, some 8 years later, and are still in many ways dealing with it today. So it is hard to convey how long that process was for some of these people. I spoke to one friend of the first man to go missing who told me that she, for years and years, would walk the same path in the Don Valley Ravine, just looking for, frankly, her friend's body. And to do that, constantly over years is really traumatic experience. And I think part of why I wanted to write the book was to drive home, exactly what that feels like insofar as I'm capable, so people can understand just how difficult these cases can be, but how important it is that we get them right.
To you, is this a story of police failure?
Yes. I think it's undeniable that this is a failure of police. And I think the police would readily admit that. It's also a story of police success. I think both can be true at the same time. I mean, police, in many ways along this investigation failed. They failed to connect missing persons cases, even though there was a huge preponderance of evidence suggesting there was a connection. They failed to continue and to devote the resources necessary to fully, delve into these missing persons cases. They failed to connect future disappearances. They failed to even, know that people were going missing as 2 of the victims disappeared without ever having a missing persons report filed on them. They failed to connect, another case, even though the similarities were glaring. They failed to lay charges against Bruce McArthur when he was accused of assault in 2016. So the failures are obvious. I don't think I need to make much of a case that there are failures there. But what I also wanted to do in this book was to highlight the things that went right. There were good officers on this case without whom we may never have connected the original cases, without whom they may not have got this necessary security footage that ultimately proved to be a huge break in the case. Without them, they may not have spotted some of the the blood stains that ultimately led to a slam dunk case that led to Bruce McArthur confessing. So there's a lot of things that went right here, and I don't think in the book the police are uniquely shouldered with blame either. I spent some time talking about the media's ability to keep up with these cases, to talk about how it is that we live in a city where people can disappear without ever really being noticed or acknowledged, and how it is that you can have a community that was built around the idea of collective safety, that had people going missing from within it and didn't seem to activate any sort of collective defense mechanism. So, I don't want this to seem like it's a police bashing book. That's not what it is, but it's absolutely realistic about the failures that go back a decade, 2 decades, and right back to, the first kind of coming out for the queer community in the 60s.
It's a kind of a paradox that we often deal with as journalists or just as members of society. When you look at a system that has failed, and then you pull the camera in and you look at the individuals who are working, the book's consistently quite sympathetic and empathetic with the police investigators. You point out when one of them is struggling with a summer cold as he gets up to give a news briefing. It's a strange thing. There's obviously a lot of cops in here who care about the work they're doing and are working really hard.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I had a hard time for a little while reconciling those two things. You're quite right. When you zoom in, you have a hard time spotting the systemic failures that you can see from a few steps back. But the more I sort of thought about it, the more I read other journalists' work about this, the more some of it started to mesh with me. So there was one book that really hit me hard, and it's Ghetto-cide by I'm blanking on the author. Leroy is her last name. I'm blanking on her first name off the top of my head. But her book does this fantastic job of looking at the spate of unsolved murders in predominantly Black neighborhoods in LA, and to sort of ask the question: how is it that these communities are consistently over-policed yet underprotected? How is it that you can go into these neighborhoods and see police everywhere? Look at the statistics and know that you're more likely to get arrested for a broken taillight or for a drug possession charge or for graffiti or whatever. But that if you get murdered, the chances of your case being solved are infinitely lower than in a white neighborhood. How is that? And she even spent some time with the homicide investigators who you meet and you absolutely believe want to solve these cases. You absolutely believe that even if there might be some latent biases or some underlying race issues, that they do genuinely want to solve these cases. So you start asking the question: how is it that those two things are sort of not meshing? And you realize the ways in which one arm of the police can frustrate the other arm. Consistently in Toronto, the homicide squad has actually been underfunded and under-resourced, while other specialized policing services, going back to the 70s, the morality squad, the intelligence squad that led the bathhouse raids, going into the 2000s, you had dedicated undercover police officers for busting men cruising in parks. You had more raids on LGBTQ parties. And I think you really have to think about how one impacts the other, how the decisions of the higher ups of headquarters can actually frustrate and hobble homicide investigations. So, when we talk about defunding the police, which I think is a really worthwhile conversation to be having right now, you kind of really, it's going to take somebody going in and realizing, okay, what parts need to get pulled back so we can have other parts work more effectively. And I think homicide and missing persons cases are really important places where we need to focus on and not pull back. Because solving homicides in these communities will ultimately make the community itself safer. But at the same time, it does mean we need to do less harassing sex workers. do less harassing homeless people, do less of criminalizing drug users. And if we do that, I think we're going to see better outcomes in terms of homicides and missing persons investigations.
So again, another paradox. The Toronto Police Service over 60 years, as you lay out in your book, had a really intense interaction with the residents and visitors to Toronto's gay village. But very often, the effect of it was to increase the danger on those people rather than to make them safer, whether it's through bathhouse raids or bathroom sting operations or surveillance. It was essentially criminalizing the day-to-day behavior of the population rather than protecting them against predators.
That's right. And you can see the outcomes of that, just as a lot of the morality operations are at an apex. And I mean, I'm talking everything from police going in to harass drag queens, because technically there was a very arcane regulation bylaw that forbade men from wearing women's underwear. So police would actually go in and do checks in that regard to make sure that none of the drag queens are too risque. As they're doing that harassment campaign, essentially, the homicide rate targeting queer people is skyrocketing. There were years where upwards of a quarter of the homicides in Toronto were targeting gay men and trans women. And when that is pretty stark for a community that at that point was actually quite small. And I actually went back and crunched some of the numbers, and even 40 years on, the unsolved rate for those what they used to call them homosexual murders is significantly higher than the overall unsolved rate for the city at large. So you kind of have to ask, how is it that this system is so broken? How is it that even today a lot of those cases remain unsolved? And you do start to kind of confront the idea that antagonizing a community you're supposed to be protecting is ultimately frustrating your job. It's ultimately making it more difficult. And I know we like to think that everything is hunky-dory and not what it was in the 70s or the 80s. But in many respects, I spoke to a lot of people who told me that that mentality hasn't gone away. And they've never truly felt that the Toronto police, and this is true for cities across North America, they've never truly felt the Toronto police have atoned for that. Mark Saunders, the chief of police in Toronto, notionally held an apology for the bathhouse raids a couple of years ago. But as one longtime queer activist told me, he never used the word sorry. He never actually apologized. He expressed some regret and said mistakes were made, but there was never an apology. And I think, I've spoken to cops who still think the bathhouse raids were worthwhile and that they were actually cracking down on, pedophilia and organized crime and whatnot. So I think there's still a fundamental, cultural disconnect between the village and the police. And it's going to take some real serious work to untangle that. And until we do, you're going to continue to see lesser outcomes in terms of public safety.
One of the things I really liked about your book, Missing from the Village, is that it's a book. It's not a simple linear progression of the facts of the police case. You pause at regular intervals to take a longer perspective or a more personal. There's passages that read like memoir. But the historic sections were really useful to me. And early on, you trace the history of the village, and you suggest that to some extent, this is a story of rapidly evolving social attitudes towards the gay community and of a sort of coalescing of the village's self-image as a community. And you suggest that when the murders start, that process hasn't completely finished. There's still prejudices in the broader community, and in the village doesn't really believe that everyone there needs to protect everyone else.
Yeah, and the historical parts I think were very intentional because I actually had a hard time finding a lot of the historical record for some of these things, specifically for the murders that targeted queer people in the 70s and 80s. There is not a lot written about that. There's not even on the bathhouse raids. There's still actually a lack in many respects of good information, good historically accurate, well written, well collected primary material. There's still a lack of even oral histories of talking to the people who were instrumental in these cases. I hosted a podcast for the CBC where we did a lot interviews with activists and police detectives and others who were in and around the community at that time. And in a lot of respects, I'm talking to these people and I'm giving them the news for the first time about some elements of their own history, and that was really galling for me. I always hate tropes and idioms that try to break this stuff down, but those who fail their history are doomed to repeat it, and that is an idea that kind of kept resonating with me. I think the fact that the queer community is ignorant about its own history in many respects leads them to a sense of complacency. And I think this story should have been the shockwave that woke them up from that. I mean, the entire idea of the village, or as it was originally called, the gay ghetto, was, it was a space where queer people could afford to live, because often they were denied housing or employment and needed a cheap, reliable place to live. But it was also collective defense. It was an idea that you can walk down the street, and if you get jumped and attacked, someone else that who's also queer on the street is going to see you. Or you can run inside a bar that is safe, where you're not going to be harassed. Or you can dress or act how you like, knowing that there's other people around who are going to see you and make you feel safe. Now, in many respects, this case is an attack on that very idea. In many respects, the fact that people were going missing from Church Street itself, from the bars that many people frequent, it should have been a jolt to the system to learn that you're not as safe as you were led on to be. And in this case, I think it's given also a venue for people to point out that this has been happening for years to trans women, particularly trans women of color, even in Toronto, even across other cities throughout North America. There have been many unsolved murders of trans women. There have been violent attacks on trans women, and the city really didn't wake up to those. I think it took the sort of headline-grabbing nature of this investigation to finally push a bunch of those issues front and center. And that's part of what I tried to do with the book, was tie a bunch of them together to say, if you want to live up to this sort of historical basis of why this community was created, you're going to need to start realizing that collective defense and sort of reforms are needed to sort of fulfill the promise that was sort of the foundation of this community itself.
Tell me about Bruce McArthur, this landscaper who floated in and out of the lives of all these people, sometimes for quite a long time before he killed them, and who managed to elude the police for close to a decade, even though he was brought in a couple times for questioning. What do we learn about this guy?
If you're going into this book with an expectation that it's going to be a step-by-step history of Bruce McArthur's life, I think you're going to be disappointed. What was stark to me, looking into a little bit of his childhood, speaking to people who've known him for years, even getting access to some of his psychological reports, he's not an interesting guy. He's not a master criminal. He's not some genius. He is a deeply troubled individual who was sloppy, who came onto police radar multiple times. He got away with this despite his own total incompetence of hiding from the police. He was arrested and charged and convicted for a 2001 assault against a man in the village, and should have been in a police database as a violent criminal. He was interviewed in 2013 in connection with the first 3 missing men and lied blatantly to the police in that interview. And luckily, for him, didn't get caught in those lies. He was arrested again in 2016 after being accused of an assault, and to his sheer dumb luck, when police ran his name through the database, he didn't pop up as having committed a violent assault on a gay man, and he didn't pop up as being connected to a trio of disappearances. I can only imagine how relieved he must have been, knowing that he got away with it again. He wasn't investigated when another person who he had a long personal relationship went missing in early 2017, and it was only his incompetence in attacking a man who he had known for many years and who had a network of well-organized, dogged friends in 2017, being Andrew Kinsman. It was only after he abducted Andrew Kinsman that police kind of finally got wise and looked at him. and actually thoroughly investigated his role in the disappearances. But there were so many steps along the way where he could have been caught, and I think that's what's really that is the important takeaway from his sort of backstory, is that he's not a clever criminal. He was not he was not incredible at escaping police scrutiny, and in many respects, it still bothers me that I have to go to interviews where people where the interviewer at the outset described him as a jovial landscaper, unassuming Santa Claus. The reality was he was very assuming. He was frequently on police radar. He was a violent criminal. I mean, it bugs me that this notion has established that he's just an everyday man, and no one, he was the innocent guy next door who no one would have ever suspected. It's not true. He should have been on police radar way earlier. And unfortunately, he wasn't apprehended until much too late.
That's one of the mysteries in the book, is this sort of catch-all database. I think, is it Versafile? Am I getting the name of it
right?
There's
Versadex. There's also a bunch of them. And this is, I think one thing you can point to the cops and say, like, why is it that you had 3 databases at the same time that often didn't plug into each other adequately?
Okay. The Versadex one is sort of it's just a place where you put interesting things that happen to you during your day as a cop, and it's not necessarily a collection of things that need to rise to the level of allowable evidence in court. It's just any intersection between a police officer and an interesting person in the community, and yet this guy who'd been hauled in by the cops, who had been engaged in suspicious behavior, had a conviction, and turns out to be in the contacts of some of these victims. It's like you say, there's this long chain of evidence that would normally have gone into a database like that would normally have caused some light bulbs to go on over people's heads, and yet it doesn't. And you air the possibility that it's maybe a sort of general attitude with marginalized communities, whether they're queer or Indigenous women or Black neighborhoods in the States, that it's a dangerous place in general. Maybe these people don't want to be found. There's all kinds of reasons for not taking these murders more seriously.
Oh, it's a pervasive attitude, and I shouldn't say it's exclusively for marginalized communities, but it seems to come up way more often with them. It's this idea that missing people, and I think we need to pause for 1 second and say there's a lot of missing people out there. There are still thousands of unsolved, open long-term missing persons cases that may well hide the fact that there's other serial predators in this country, and often we do a really terrible job at devoting the resources necessary to look into those cases. But all too often, when police get a missing persons case, particularly of an adult male, but more so for racialized individuals, for queer people, and so on, there's this explanation that comes up that they vacated their life, and that's the actual phrase I've heard cops using. This idea that they just picked up and left, and it comes from, in this case, I think it very much came from this belief that these men, because they were refugees and immigrants, and because they were queer, and some of them living, still married to a woman, but still trying to figure out their own sexuality, there was this pervasive belief that they would just get flighty and just take off. There was one man who, Abdul Basser Faizi, the second man to go missing, police seemed to think he had flown back to Afghanistan, the country he had left a decade earlier in the midst of a civil war, a country that I don't think he would have felt safe in, and he had said as much. They believed that he had just gone back, even though he didn't access any of his funds, his money, his credit cards, even though he didn't have his passport, even though his car was found abandoned the opposite direction of the airport and his house. They seemed to think it was possible that he just went back home and would never be found again. And if you give yourself that explanation, no matter how ludicrous it is, you tend to pull back and go, well, this is never going to be solved because he's happy somewhere else. And that attitude in missing persons cases is super dangerous. 3 missing men disappeared from roughly the same geographic area. All 3 went to the same bars. All 3 used some of the same dating apps. All 3 looked the same, were of the same age, same skin tone, same facial hair even. To look at those 3 cases and go, well, maybe they all independently went back home. That's insane. That requires such a suspension of disbelief it's really frustrating to look back on now, because as soon as I saw those cases, and this was true for many people in the community, as soon as they saw those cases, they went, "There's no way they disappeared independently of each other." It's just it just strains credibility. And yet, police opened an investigation to one of the missing persons with 12 investigators with significant resources. Ultimately, found out that it wasn't one; it was three, and actually pulled back on the investigation. Removed about 10 of the officers from the investigation. That is actually when these really smart detectives connected it to Bruce McArthur, brought him in for an interview in 2013, asked him about these disappearances, and unfortunately didn't get the evidence they needed to keep going, and the investigation was shut down in early 2014. That is really frustrating. There was not the urgency or the certainty there that there ought to have been. And I think if there had been, things may have been very different.
I asked about Bruce McArthur, and you said, if you're looking for this kind of thing, my book is not that kind of thing. You actually deal in the last chapter with your own discomfort with the form of the crime book. I mean, it's a rough task you set yourself. You wanted to write a book that is true and that is about crime without it being a true crime book. What's the distinction, and how did you struggle with that?
So it's funny, I mentioned a little bit in the book, but several years ago, while working on another really grisly homicide, the murder case involving Luca Magnotta in Montreal, I had been covering it for a number of outlets and got asked to write a book. And I remember sitting there and writing about a chapter and thinking to myself, I hate this. And I was writing it kind of like the true crime books that I'm used to seeing out there. And I sat there and thought to myself, who is this helping? Apart from folks who want a grisly beach read, who is this benefiting? What issues am I taking aim at here? What change can come about from this book? Or is this ultimately just going to antagonize and agonize the folks who've already been hurt by this story so much? And I basically put the book down at that point and said, I'm never finishing this. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm not writing this. So when it came to this story, I had exactly the same attitude. I basically told myself, I'm not getting into this. I'm not going to produce a pulpy true crime book. And it was Robin Doolittle at the Globe when I was covering the story there, who came up to me and handed me her agent's card and said, just shut up, just go grab lunch with Martha, and I think you're going to change your mind. And it was over lunch with my future agent, and then there's some future conversation with my publisher where I kept saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, and they kept saying, that's fine, just don't do it. Do it however you like. And it's not like I'm reinventing the wheel. There's other really smart authors out there who I've taken cues from, who have figured out how to use these stories as a vehicle for some broader societal conversation. I mean, this book comes out at a time when we're talking about defunding the police, at a time when we're talking about violence against trans women, at a time we're talking about the underservice of police in marginalized communities, and conversations about how to bring in maybe non-traditional police officers into investigations where they may be needed. And I hope this book uses a lot of the lessons we should have learned in this case, and the lessons we should have learned in cases from the past, as a vehicle to kind of bring some evidence into those conversations and to provide a bit of an underpinning for those conversations about reform. But it's also just not an academic policy focused work. It's also supposed to be a book telling the story of these men's lives. It was really frustrating to me to watch a lot of this coverage, to see 8 men's lives reduced to a couple of words. All too often I would see newspaper stories or TV reports that would just summarize them as 8 men of color in the closet. Well, that's not true. One of them was white. Several of them were openly queer. Several of them were openly bisexual. Some of them wouldn't consider themselves gay. There is such a fascinating backstory in each one of these cases that I think tells us a lot about, what it means to be queer, what it means to be an immigrant or a refugee, that I think is worth sitting and looking at. And I think once you do that, you realize, these men's stories are worth considering, maybe even more so than Bruce McArthur's. I mean, one of these men was a passenger on the MV Sunsea, the boat that docked in Vancouver in 2011, full of Tamil refugees, that the then Harper government basically demonized as terrorists and human smugglers. Well, this man is evidence of how much those policies failed. And I think once you start kind of peeling back a lot of these stories, there's a lot to be learned here. And I think there's real value in that. So if this book helps as proof positive that you can do a book that is both humanizing, policy oriented, and not grotesque or sort of or rubbernecking, I think I'm very happy that it's done that.
So I think this is the guy you're talking about, Krishna Kumar Kanagaratnam. And one of the things that I like about the book is at intervals throughout it are these pencil sketches of the guys who were murdered and of the locations of the book. And it's not extraneous to the material of the book. You also take the time to tell their stories. First of all, who did those pencil illustrations?
Lachlan Donald is his name. He's this great young illustrator that we stumbled upon, and I'm just incredibly happy. We had originally talked about using photos of the men. We have some photos of many of these men, but it was really frustrating to me to realize that we didn't have great photos of several of them. So Krishna Kumar is a great example. He spent many of his years in Canada basically in hiding from immigration authorities out of fear of being deported. So there's not a lot of photos of him. So I was trying to figure out a way where we can kind of show what these men looked like at kind of a happier time, without having to rely on some of those, some of the less flattering photos. And I was really happy with how the illustrations came out. I think it's done a fantastic job. I was so happy when they came in. I was really nervous, and then they finally came in, and it was a really calming experience.
What was your process of writing the book like? This was your first, your first book, I think, published in hardcover. I seem to recall an ebook experiment a few years ago.
And I think you were the first person to buy that ebook. I think I recall vividly. You gave me enough money for food that week.
What was the title of that book, just for posterity's sake?
I don't remember. It was. So I know I'll own up to it, and I'll get a swipe in at John Ibbotson and Daryl Bricker when I do it. It was called Harper Will Win Again. But there's an asterisk at the end. It was a story about how it would really take some clever sociological thought to figure out how to beat Stephen Harper. And in the end, I don't know. I haven't reread that book in a while, but I feel like some of it might hold up. Maybe it doesn't. So, but it wasn't quite as declarative as The Big Shift. I did not proclaim a century of conservative rule. Let me just say that.
Yeah, John's next book could simply be called "I Take It Back." I hated writing my books. What was it like for you?
It was difficult. So, a lot of folks, I have friends who took, book sabbaticals from their job and kind of spent their days, sitting on the porch and drinking tea and thinking about it. I'm not making fun of them. That sounds like a lovely experience. For me, I'm still a freelance journalist. I still need to go and feed myself and sell stories. So I spent, I basically worked days, and then at night went to the bar across the street from where I was living in Parkdale at the time. And I'll even give them a plug, Food and Liquor, a great neighborhood bar, in my old hood, that I just sat in a corner and basically typed out most of this book from there. I did some parts of it in quarantine, in our home office in the evenings. I pulled some all-nighters, in the long dark days of March and April. And I tried to sort of write whenever I could, but it was a hard experience. I didn't anticipate. I anticipated it would be a lot of work, and however much I anticipated, it was twice that. There and parts of it are hard. I mean, there were parts of this book I sat, and it was fun to write. Some of the historical record was really fascinating to get into. Certain parts of it was so easy. Certain parts of this book were really difficult. I can imagine they're difficult to read, but they were incredibly difficult to write. I don't relish in making other people relive the worst experiences of their life. I don't enjoy sitting and listening to interviews I've done or interviews that other people have given, or messages that were sent to me that, or even just the victim impact statements that were read out in court that describe the trauma and the PTSD that comes along with not just being involved in an investigation of this type, but being involved for so long. And there was times where I had to sit, close the computer, just wipe my eyes, and go do anything else. It was a really hard book in some respects, but in the end, I'm kind of happy with how it came out, and I think I'm supposed to write another one now.
What's that one going to be about?
Well, okay, I'll give it away. I was craving, because, and now I feel like I've gotten in this niche of looking into how police systems can do better, because I think there's a real dearth, especially with the decline of newsrooms, not having cop reporters, not having as many justice reporters. It's really hard. And the one thing that struck me recently is that there's not been a lot of good things written about how police use force in terms of crowd control. And it's one thing, I'm seeing every day now, especially in the States, but in a large degree in Canada. All of the rules that we seem to have built for our police departments go out the window as soon as there's a crowd of a few thousand people. Suddenly, use of force is just willy-nilly. You can fire tear gas canisters and rubber bullets at people without any sort of process or regard. And I think that's what I'm looking at for my next book, is questioning how effective that strategy is. And actually, I think it plugs into what I was saying earlier. When you have a police force that comes in to basically, militarize the streets and, take back control from protesters, it's really hard for them to come back in a few weeks later to try to solve a homicide. The folks who live in that neighborhood still remember what it was like to see a phalanx of cops, firing tear gas canisters, at everybody that moved. So, I think that is something I think is a really worthwhile conversation going forward. And I haven't seen it elsewhere in the world. So I guess that is my call to action, to do it myself.
Probably a very exciting project for your agent, because this is one that has some hope of selling outside of Canada.
Well, yeah. I've been surprised at how much interest there's been in this case from the States and from beyond. And I will say, between doing this and between doing the podcast that I did with the CBC, part of what I wanted to do was to give a sort of roadmap to folks in other cities across Canada, but also other cities across America and elsewhere, to do the same sort of thing in their community. Because what was galling for me is the degree to which there were both kind of pervasive violence against queer people everywhere, and that often went unsolved, but also that there were serial killers that were allowed to operate right under the nose of police. And in some cases, they were police even. And there just was not the collective alarm system that you would expect from a serial killer. There's one part in the book where I talk about 3 separate serial killers operating in California roughly at the same time, who between them probably killed upwards of 100 queer men. Where is that in our collective sort of knowledge of serial killers and serial violence against communities? There's a lot of Netflix specials devoted to homicides that I think have been, over-examined and have largely just been turned into sort of pop entertainment. But, where is our sort of interest in these cases that expose fundamental inequalities, that expose, fundamentally ineffective policing strategies? And that bugs me. And so part of what this book was about was to point to other people in San Francisco, in California, in Toronto, London, or sorry, not Toronto, New York, London, and so on, to say, you can do this too. You can go back and look at these cases. There's probably unsolved murders or disappearances in your city, probably of marginalized and queer people, that may point to a serial killer. So you should go look at it. And I think there would be real value in that. There was evidence of several serial killers targeting queer people across the world that have not been brought to justice yet. So I kind of hope that maybe this does, make some impact in the States and encourage people to do some of this work locally.
Now, you're a character in your own story. I mean, your relationship with the police on this story was antagonistic at the beginning, because you were positing a serial killer in your writing for Vice and some writing that you did for Maclean's at a time when they were denying that was a possibility. And you tell the story of how you get drawn into, to some extent, to the investigation of the thing. And I sensed that sometimes you were struggling with a basic question, which is how much of Justin Ling should there be in Justin Ling's book? Was that a hard call to make from page to page?
Sort of. I think I initially had places where I was more present that I pulled back in. There's initially places where I didn't kind of have my own story that I kind of filled it in. And it wasn't some attempt at self-aggrandizing. I kind of said repeatedly, I didn't solve this case and I was never going to. It's not as though I was, this brilliant, detective Miss Marple type who was going to figure the whole thing out. That was just never going to happen. And I was never deluded enough to think I was going to do that. I mean, I repeatedly refer to myself in the book as a bit player. As a member of the media, it's rare to bump into another queer journalist. And that's really frustrating sometimes. So it did feel kind of lonely. And I think to some degree, I kind of did want to highlight that, I was the only one following up on this in 2015, 2016, 2017, what I shouldn't have been. So it was not to say, look at how smart and clever I am. It was, here is this obvious story of something terribly wrong. How is it that we have such a robust, local news ecosystem in Toronto, yet no one has thought to follow up on this, that there has been no follow-up, that there has been no kind of nagging at the police. Because I firmly believe, and I know this is going to sound like a trope, but I firmly believe if 3 white women had gone missing, there would have been a lot more questions asked, and there would have been a lot more follow-up, as there should be. Which is not to say that we should ignore cases of white women going missing. It's to say that everyone should get that treatment. And so I think to some degree, I put myself in the book to showcase that, there needs to be someone doing this work, and to show that, there is barriers when you go to do this work as well, and there shouldn't be. It shouldn't have had to be me constantly nagging at police to release information on this. It was also to showcase to some degree how conservative policing is in Canada in respect of flow of information. I shouldn't have had to beg and plead for details of this case. I didn't include it in the book, but there was this really jarring juxtaposition that I saw when I was working on the podcast. And it was that I was going to Toronto police saying, I would like some information about some of these cold case homicides targeting queer men going back to the 70s. You're not still investigating them. You're not still interviewing witnesses. So why don't you give me some of this information and see if I can go talk to some folks that maybe you couldn't get to or didn't want to talk to you. And no, they basically said, we're not giving you a damn thing. We're not even going to confirm what cases are still open, what are closed, and we're not even going to tell you, a single useful piece of evidence. I went down to just outside Detroit, and when I showed up to ask about one specific case, they had the entire investigative record laid out on the table. And I go through every interview note, went through every single crime scene photo, every single piece of evidence. And there's utility in that. There is utility in giving reporters that sort of access, because they can reach people who don't have the same animosity as they may have towards the police. They can connect things. And in my case, I'm queer. This is a community that I know and am a part of. As to the best of my knowledge, few or none of the officers on this investigation were queer. They did a very good job of reaching out to the community, but I think there's utility in the idea that you can bring other people in, bring people with different skill sets, bring people with different experiences in, and kind of give them a role in that investigation. Even again, if the journalists are not going to solve it, I think that at the very least, they can have a useful role in communicating with the public. So I did want to showcase the degree to which I tried to move that barrier a bit, but ultimately it didn't budge.
That's a classic story that is familiar to any reporter who's tried to do serious work inside Canada and outside Canada. Is you very quickly, it's confirmed to you that there's this huge cultural bias in Canada against sharing information, against saying things that there's no reason not to say them. And in the book, early on, there's a police officer that you reach out to in your own reporting who clearly is struggling with the force to try and get you, basically try and throw you a bone, get something out to you that's usable information. And that officer says, what we all tell each other as young journalists starting out trying to cover murders is, it's extraordinarily distasteful work. But any scrap of information may be the germ of a new lead that can make some change and lead to some good in this world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's frustrating to just have that fundamental kind of philosophical mismatch with the police, all too often. And there is evidence that this is changing a little bit. I think even in this case, after McArthur's arrest, you saw Hank Nsinga, who led the investigation, who's now the head homicide in Toronto, seem to recognize the utility of speaking to the media and speaking to the public. The frequent news conferences, the kind of the slightly more open kind of principles they used were helpful, and they were, I think, useful. And I hope they kind of do that more going forward. But in this case, it was also frustrating to watch the Toronto police try to control the messaging to a point that it was clear that they were trying to cover their own ass. And that really bothered me through this investigation. And you can read some parts of the book where I'm sure it sounds like I'm spitting with rage. And I am, like, I was writing it. There was times where I thought I was going to break my keyboard. I was so angry. There was a point in this investigation where, in an editorial board meeting with the Globe and Mail, Chief Saunders sat there and said, we did the best we could. It was the community who wasn't bringing information to us. And they said he was able to navigate in the community, and people were not coming to us with leads. That was incredibly insulting on its face. It was such a galling statement just from what we knew at that point. But what was even more troubling is that in the days after that interview, I got a phone call, through some intermediaries, from an officer inside the Toronto Police Service who represented, beyond them, several others, all of whom were furious at the chief because they knew what he had known at that time. What we didn't know in the public was that they'd interviewed Bruce McArthur already, was that they interviewed him in 2013 and had let him go. So, and they interviewed him partly because people in the community were pointing to him, were saying, go talk to Bruce McArthur. The last time I saw my friend was with Bruce McArthur. So for the chief to sit there and basically gaslight the community and say they weren't coming to us, knowing full well that the community had brought them some evidence that pointed to Bruce McArthur, was really galling. And their attempts to sort of control the flow of information, to essentially hide that interview, to hide his 2016 arrest, was, I really think, an effort of sort of information warfare with the public. And I really don't think we've fully reckoned with how gross that was. Also worth noting is that they've essentially tried to railroad one officer and make him wear a lot of these failures. There was one officer who had interviewed McArthur in 2016 after he was accused of assault, who did all the requisite checks in the databases, found nothing, had no particular reason to think that McArthur was a dangerous offender, and let him, and along with some other officers, let him go. That one officer is now basically being rung up on charges that I think is basically an effort to scapegoat him. So, even as the police are being quite conservative with how they release information, they're also weaponizing some of the information they do have to try to shift blame. And I think it's really frustrating because, again, like I said earlier, there is so much good police work in this story. There's so many examples that you can point to and say, this is how you do policing right. This is how you work with the community. This is how you follow leads. This is how you catch a serial killer. And I think by trying to push down a lot of the valid criticism, they're just muddying the waters, and it's really frustrating to watch. And I think between this book and between an external review that's coming out in the next couple of months, I think the public might finally get a sense of exactly what went right and what went wrong in this investigation.
That, to some extent, anticipates what I think will be my last question, which is, do you think this book is going to be able to produce some positive change?
I don't know. I mean, what's frustrating, and I go into it again in the book, is that we already had a really good roadmap to deal with missing persons cases. We already had a really good, action plan for how to build relations with marginalized communities. And it was the Wally Opal report that came out actually right around the time the men started going missing from the village. It was written after the arrest of Robert Pickton, as the city tried to grapple with the extent of the failure in the downtown east side. It made a lot of clear and specific recommendations, not recommendations, like demands basically on how Vancouver police ought to reform, but it was also a whole bunch of recommendations that applied to police departments across Canada. And unfortunately, a lot of those recommendations were ignored in Toronto. Just the most basic one was that cities need dedicated missing persons teams. They need a team of investigators whose sole job it is to look at outstanding long-term missing persons cases and try to connect them and continue revisiting them and to make sure they don't get forgotten or left in a filing cabinet somewhere. Toronto didn't do that. Toronto for decades, even if it was told bluntly that this sort of thing can help catch a serial killer, can help make sure that you don't miss people, wasn't done. So it's finally been done following this investigation, but I think there's still questions about whether it's well-resourced enough. But there's still a litany of other fronts on which Toronto police are still behind the curve by decades when it comes to dealing with marginalized communities and when it comes to dealing with missing persons cases and unsolved homicides. There were recommendations going back to the 1980s following the bathhouse raids that could have been really instructive, that should have been really instructive for how police deal with the queer community, that were just never quite adopted. So do I think this book is going to make a difference? I hope so, but I'm just really pessimistic, because all too often police are given this really thorough set of strategies that can be adopted to fix these problems, and they'll adopt a couple or they'll half-ass a few of them, and all too often those reports are just left to lie there, totally forgotten. So I'm not sure that anything's gonna be different this time. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm just skeptical.
Well, that's fair, and I guess the only hope for a book like this to make an impact is for people to find out about it and for people to read the book, and that's why I'm really glad you're able to join us, Justin Ling. The book is Missing from the Village. It's out everywhere on Maclean and Stewart. Good publisher. And there's an audio book where Justin, you read your own book.
I did, which was a weird experience. But if you want to hear me read the book, we really should give people an option. You should have been able to have, you or I don't know, Eugene Levy doing it. But unfortunately, it's just me.
Well, anyway, thanks for Justin. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to everyone at home. This has been another conversation brought to you by our sponsors of the Canadian Bankers Association. And as always, we thank them for making these conversations possible. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks. Thanks once again. Good night.